I just added a little more functionality. I created the ability to add a new client. And it's pretty interesting what I did as far as an architectural standpoint. I tried to reuse functionality to try and keep the code compact, which actually kind of makes things a little more difficult as far as using the functionality, but the functions, but it's pretty slick actually what I did here, so I kind of want to show it off. Right now, as we know, I've got the previous functionality is that we've got the database here and we can load the old information, and we've got that real-time aspect to it where if I update here, it updates there, and the vice versa is also true. So if we go back, now I'm going to add a new client. That's the new functionality, and I wanted to keep the URL structure the same and kind of keep like a REST URL type deal. So you can see that when I load a client and I pass in the client ID, you can see that this ZD is this ZD here. So I'm sending the client ID to the database, and that's how it's, or to the, actually I'm sending the client ID to View, and View is pulling it from the database using that. I'll show how that gets passed through and how that ultimately gets its way to the function call. But I also wanted to be able to pass in add. Now the way things are set up, add is really no different from they're both strings. So I'll kind of show you, walk through what I was able to do to make that functionality happen where it differentiates between the two. So the other thing I want you to see is that I'm on the dashboard now. When I click add new, up at the dashboard you're going to see client/add load, and then all of a sudden it's going to flip to the new ID. So let's start back from the beginning. I want to get the URLs right. So now when I click add, you're going to see it say /client add, and then the add is going to flip to the new ID. So here we go. It says add, and then it flipped to the new ID. So that's some asynchronous functionality going on there that I want to talk about. So let's dive into the code and talk about that. So here we are in the code, and let's just start from the router. The router is the client, the /client, so that is, what we're seeing up here. And this is a variable that allows us to take any information past this slash and pass it through. So either add or the client ID will come through in this variable. I'm passing it through as a prop to the component client. Component client comes from the components client directory, and I don't have to add the .view. It's just smart enough to know. So that's the components client view is what gets loaded. So I'll load that up, and this is the view for the form. You can see here's the form stuff here, the first name, middle name, last name. That is this form right here. Let's see if I can shrink this down and keep them both on screen. Not beautifully. So, and as we said, the router passes in this variable as a prop. So now I need to go to my client view, my client component, and you can see the props, which are passed in variables. That I just I say, hey, that's the variable I'm expecting, and now that's going to become a variable in my local view here to work with. So none of this does anything until created hits. This gets called as soon as the view gets loaded. And I just send to the store, I reach out to the store and I say, hey, get me a primary relative caregiver by ID. And I don't say, whether add or new, I just don't tell it anything yet, but I just pass through that client ID. This client ID, which is my prop that's passed through, can right now be either add or a client ID. So let's take a look at the store. If I go to get primary relative caregiver by ID in my store, and that happens to be landed right there on that function beautifully. So this is what's coming in. This variable right here is either going to be, that variable right there is either going to be add or the client ID. Forget about this for now. This just, if I have a listener listening already, then I just kill it. That's for when we get into the existing. So if this variable, which comes to here, if it is add, which it is in the case of the blank form when I click add new, I first of all delete any current primary relative caregiver. So this is my object that stores the information about what's currently loaded here. So if I go back and I load one that's already populated, and I go to my view storage and I look at the current primary relative caregiver object, this is what's storing the information globally. Now you'll see if I go back to the main dashboard, this object is not destroyed. It still exists. That's because it's a global component to my application. It hasn't been dropped. So that's why when I click into this old one, it's there for a second, and then that asynchronous call comes, and then it comes back with the new information. And this one didn't have anything, but I'll put some in there, and you'll see that gets updated. And when I go back to this one, to the one with my name, you'll watch that it loaded the old information for a second there, then it made that asynchronous call and updated the information to the correct information for this URL. Now I really should zero that out so that that's not shown, and I will do that. And that's kind of what I do when I do this add new client. That's what's happening there. That's what this call does right here, is I reinitialize that global variable with null. So if I go and look for this initialize current primary relative caregiver, it's a mutation so that the global storage knows about it. And I just basically set the state.current primary relative caregiver, which is my global storage, state primary caregiver relative. I set it back to the beginning of the application when it was null, because I'm passing in null this time. I pass in null, and therefore I just set the state one to what's passed in, which is null. So I'm basically resetting my my state to null in case there was something there. So if it's the first time you load the page, there won't be something there. If you've looked at another client, then that client will be populated, and that's why we have to zero it out. Next, I dispatch a commit because I need to go and tell the database to, hey, create a new object for me and give me an ID for it. So that's why I run this commit, and this is the same commit that I call when I do an update. If we go back to client, when I do the submit here, it's that exact same commit. So I can either commit old or new, or so that I'm using the same functions for the same thing to try and keep for different things, same function for different things, to try and keep my codes more compact rather than having 5 different functions for 5 different things. So it dispatches this call. So let's go and find that. We've cleared out any current information. We've cleared it out, and so now we're going to go to the database. That's this call down here. It's just a blank call, and now it's using the global storage object. So there's that current primary relative caregiver, which I just zeroed out. So if that thing is true, well, it's false right now. It's null. So don't even do any of this other stuff. It's null. We don't go into here. We fail that. We go into the else condition, which means we're in a new entry according to my comments, which means my commenting is accurate. And then we call the Firebase store. We tell it the collection, and then we just add an empty object. And what that does is that goes out to the store, adds the object, and then it returns a promise. So when that's finished, it sends back Firestore, calls this function when that asynchronous functionality is done, and it passes us this docref, which is the object that tells us about what just happened. And if we call the ID on that, I've now got the ID for the empty object that I just created in the database. So if we go back to the front end, and we go back kind of from the beginning, and we talk about adding a new client, that is this ID that's coming back after this is being made. So we're at the point where this just got us, well, actually it's the blank one, the DF one. So it got blanked. It created a new empty object, and that's the call we just made, was this right here, that to add a new empty object but get back the ID for us. So I get back the ID, and now I do two things. You saw that after add, it switched to the ID. So that's this second call here, is that I simply replace the current route in the screen. This is called a route. With this route, I replace it with /client and the docref ID. So now it looks like I came from, I loaded a any client that had already been stored there. And the cool thing about the replace is it doesn't add to the history, it replaces the current one. So if they click the back button, if I click the back button, I don't go back to add, I go back to dashboard. That add looks like it never existed. So that's a cool functionality right there. But before that, I dispatch to the this function, which is the same function that I call from the store, get primary relative caregiver ID. So when I first loaded this, I called this with add. Well, now I'm doing the same thing. I'm calling that same thing, but now instead of add, I'm calling that with an actual document ref ID. So let's go and find that. So I'm kind of being circular here in my functionality. I'm being recursive, but I'm changing the objects that let me load whatever's happening. So this comes through now. The first time that came through as add, so that's why we went into this functionality. This time it's coming through with a document ID, so that's great. So that means we're going to run this functionality here, which what this does is this goes out to the Firestore, and it gets, based on that ID that I just brought in, it goes and gets that empty object that I just created. Now, why did I do that? It seems silly to create it, go out and get it, and come back and just get the empty thing. But what this does right here, this functionality sets up a listener object. So Firebase goes and makes that call and gets that empty object, but it returns a listener object, which I store in my state, and that's what this is. It's stored up here in my up in my state, so it's just something that sticks around. So it can be a listener that sticks around, and it says, hey, this gets called because it's a promise from the onSnapshot, which is functionality of the query. This, and I'm keeping this around. This whatever's in here is going to get called anytime an update happens to the object in the database. So that's the functionality of information going from here back to here. I need to set up that listener. If I don't set up that listener, then when I set information here, so when I start to add information here, it shows up here. Now I added the listener back, so the information should come back. If I add an A, it should show back up there, which it does. If I didn't do that last listener call, that functionality wouldn't be there. It wouldn't have that listener. So that's what that is there. And I talked about this protection mechanism in a previous video, just to stop local writes from coming back to itself. So that's what happens there. That's the and once you get in here, this is just simply any information that comes back goes to the initialize function and updates the object to be whatever came back. So I think that pretty much takes us through the whole functionality of creating a new object. I'm reusing the same functions, but just paying attention to what I pass to them rather than having separate functions. And that way I can just keep my code minimized and use the same calls wherever I need to. So hopefully that was pretty clear. Again, pretty cool functionality, or pretty simple functionality. You'll notice too that there is still some issues where if I add a new client and I don't put any information, well, now I've got an empty client there, so I can do this all day long and create new empty clients. So I got to figure out how to keep that from happening, or find something that cleans the database every so often to get rid of those, so that they're not in the statistics of later on. So that's it for that functionality. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Have a great day.